The bitter October wind of 1849 swept across the isolated hills of southeastern Ohio, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and something far more sinister, the stench of corruption that seemed to emanate from the very soil of the Ashcroft property. Nestled in a valley so remote that even the most adventurous travelers avoided it, the Ashcroft homestead stood like a festering wound upon the landscape, its weathered buildings and overgrown fields bearing witness to decades of unspeakable practices. Josiah Ashcroft stood at the window of his study, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the fading daylight, as he gazed out at the family cemetery that dotted the hillside behind his house. 37 wooden crosses marked the graves of children who had lived brief, tortured lives before succumbing to the genetic horrors wrought by generations of inbreeding. To most men, such a sight would have brought overwhelming grief and self-reflection. To Josiah, it was proof of God's divine plan. "The weak are called home early," he murmured to himself, his fingers tracing the worn pages of the leather-bound journal where he recorded his divine revelations. Only the strong survive to carry on the sacred bloodline. At 62, Josiah Ashcroft was a man consumed by religious mania and sexual depravity. Though he saw no distinction between the two, his wild grey hair hung to his shoulders, and his beard, stained yellow with tobacco juice, framed a face marked by the same genetic abnormalities that plagued his offspring. One eye sat slightly higher than the other, and his left hand bore 6 fingers, marks that he proclaimed as signs of divine favor rather than the products of incestuous breeding. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention from the window. Martha Ashcroft, his wife and sister, entered the study with the shuffling gait of a woman aged beyond her years by repeated childbirth and unimaginable trauma. At 58, she had borne Josiah 11 children, though only 7 had survived past infancy. Her once beautiful face was now gaunt and hollow-eyed, marked by the premature aging that seemed to afflict all the Ashcroft women. "Husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the family is gathering in the barn. Rebecca, she seems troubled by tonight's ceremony." Josiah's expression darkened at the mention of his youngest daughter. Rebecca, at 16, was the most beautiful of his children, having somehow escaped the worst of the genetic damage that marked her siblings. Her beauty, however, was not what drew his attention. It was her growing resistance to the family's ways, her questioning of the divine revelations that had guided the Ashcroft lineage for 3 generations. "Rebecca will learn to accept God's will," Josiah replied, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. "Tonight, she will be joined to Thomas in holy matrimony, and their union will strengthen our covenant with the Almighty." Martha's face twitched at the mention of the planned ceremony. Thomas was Rebecca's older brother, already married to 2 of his sisters in previous marriages of the alliance. The thought of her youngest daughter suffering the same fate filled Martha with a mixture of dread and resignation. She had long ago learned that questioning Josiah's divine visions brought only pain and punishment. "She's been asking questions," Martha continued hesitantly, "about the children who have died, about why so many are born different. I fear she may try to resist." Josiah turned from the window, his mismatched eyes blazing with fanatic fervor. "Then we will remind her of the consequences of defying God's will. Bring me the journal of punishments." It's time Rebecca learned what happens to those who question the sacred covenant. As Martha hurried to retrieve the requested journal, Josiah's mind wandered back to the early days of his religious awakening. He had been only 23 when the first vision came to him, a dream so vivid and compelling that it had changed the course of his life forever. In that vision, God himself had appeared to Josiah, explaining that the corruption of the outside world had made it necessary for the chosen few to maintain their purity through sacred unions within their own bloodline. The vision had been followed by others, each more detailed and explicit than the last. God had shown Josiah the future, a world cleansed of sin and corruption, populated only by the pure descendants of the Ashcroft lineage. To achieve this divine destiny, the family must remain isolated from the outside world, must marry only within their own blood, and must be willing to sacrifice anything and anyone who threatened their sacred mission. Martha returned with the journal, its pages filled with detailed accounts of the punishments inflicted upon family members who had dared to question Josiah's authority. The entries made for horrific reading, descriptions of beatings, starvation, and worse torments inflicted in the name of divine justice. The most recent entry concerned Sarah Ashcroft, Josiah's niece, who had been subjected to weeks of purification rituals before finally escaping the compound 3 weeks prior. Sarah's betrayal will not be repeated, Josiah declared, running his finger down the list of punishments. Tonight, Rebecca will see what happens to those who defy God's will. And then she will take her place at Thomas's side, as the Almighty has commanded. Meanwhile, in the converted barn that served as the family's place of worship, 23 members of the Ashcroft clan were gathering for the evening ceremony. The building had been transformed over the years into a grotesque parody of a church, its walls covered with crude religious symbols and biblical verses taken wildly out of context. At the far end of the barn stood an altar made from rough-hewn timber, its surface stained dark with the blood of countless rituals. Rebecca Ashcroft sat on one of the wooden benches, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she tried to control the trembling that had seized her body. Around her, the familiar faces of her family members seemed alien and threatening in the flickering candlelight. These were people she had known and loved all her life, yet tonight they felt like strangers, or worse, like willing participants in her destruction. To her left sat her cousin Mary, a girl of 14 who had been married to her own father the previous year. Mary's pregnancy was already showing, though everyone in the family knew that her chances of delivering a healthy child were slim. The Ashcroft bloodline had been so corrupted by generations of inbreeding that normal births had become increasingly rare. On Rebecca's right sat her brother James, a 20-year-old man whose mind had never developed beyond that of a child. James rocked back and forth in his seat, humming tunelessly to himself as he played with a wooden cross that hung around his neck. His presence served as a constant reminder of what the family's practices had wrought, a generation of children marked by physical and mental abnormalities that grew worse with each passing year. "Rebecca," a voice whispered beside her, and she turned to see her cousin Daniel, one of the few family members who still seemed to retain some measure of sanity. "You don't have to go through with this. There are ways to escape, if you're willing to take the risk." Rebecca's heart leaped at Daniel's words, but she quickly suppressed the hope that threatened to overwhelm her. She had seen what happened to family members who tried to leave, the punishments, the purification rituals, the systematic breaking of their will until they begged to return to the fold. "Where would I go?" she whispered back. "This is all I've ever known, the outside world. Father says it's full of sin and corruption." Daniel's face hardened with an emotion Rebecca had rarely seen in the Ashcroft compound: anger. "Look around you, Rebecca. Look at what our purity has created. The children who die in agony, the ones born with twisted bodies and broken minds. Is this really what God wants?" Before Rebecca could respond, the barn doors swung open with a crash that echoed through the building like thunder. Josiah Ashcroft strode into the makeshift church, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every person present. Behind him walked Martha and Thomas, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. "Children of my blood," Josiah's voice boomed through the barn, carrying with it the authority of a man who had never been questioned or defied. "Tonight we gather to witness another sacred union, another step in our divine mission to preserve the purity of our bloodline. The family members began to hum a low, discordant hymn that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floors and into Rebecca's very bones. The sound was unlike any church music she had ever heard. It was primal, almost animalistic, carrying with it an undertone of menace that made her skin crawl. For 3 generations, Josiah continued, his voice rising above the humming, the Ashcroft family has followed the path that God himself has laid before us. We have remained pure while the outside world has fallen into corruption. We have preserved the sacred bloodline while others have polluted theirs with the taint of foreign blood. Rebecca's mind flashed to memories of the outside world, brief glimpses she had caught during rare trips to the nearest town for supplies. She remembered seeing families with healthy children, couples who seemed to genuinely love each other, people who laughed and smiled without the constant undercurrent of fear that permeated the Ashcroft compound. Were those people really as corrupted as her father claimed? "Tonight," Josiah declared, his gaze falling directly on Rebecca, "my youngest daughter will join with my eldest son in holy matrimony. Their union will strengthen our covenant with the Almighty and ensure that our bloodline remains untainted for generations to come." Thomas stepped forward, his hand extended toward Rebecca with a smile that chilled her to the bone. At 24, he was already the father of 3 children by his sister wives, though only one had survived past its first birthday. His face bore the same genetic abnormalities as his father, the mismatched eyes, the slightly deformed features that marked all the Ashcroft offspring. "Come, sister," Thomas said, his voice carrying the same fanatic devotion as Josiah's. "Come and take your place in God's plan." Rebecca's legs felt like lead as she rose from her seat. Around her, the humming grew louder, more insistent, as if the very air itself was pressing her toward the altar. She took one step, then another, each movement feeling like a betrayal of everything her heart told her was right. But as she reached the center aisle, a sound from outside the barn made everyone freeze. It was the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, growing louder with each passing second. Josiah's face darkened with rage as he realized that their sacred ceremony was about to be interrupted. "Who dares disturb our holy gathering?" he roared, his voice echoing off the barn walls. The answer came in the form of the barn doors, bursting open once again, this time revealing Sheriff William Hayes and 3 of his deputies. The lawmen stood silhouetted against the night sky, their hands resting on the grips of their weapons as they took in the bizarre scene before them. Sheriff Hayes was a man in his 40s, weathered by years of frontier law enforcement, but unprepared for the horror he was about to uncover. He had come to the Ashcroft property based on the testimony of Sarah Ashcroft, the young woman who had escaped 3 weeks prior. Her account of the family's practices had been so disturbing that Hayes had initially dismissed it as the ravings of a traumatized mind. But when Dr. Edmund Whitmore had examined the girl and confirmed the physical evidence of her claims, the sheriff had known he had no choice but to act. "Josiah Ashcroft," Hayes said, his voice steady despite the grotesque scene before him, "you and your family are under investigation for crimes against nature and the laws of God and man." The confrontation that would determine the fate of the Ashcroft lineage had begun, but Rebecca sensed that before the night was over, the hills of Ohio would be stained with blood, and the true horror of her family's practices would finally be revealed to the world. Sheriff Hayes had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, poring over Sarah Ashcroft's testimony and the physical evidence that Dr. Whitmore had documented. The young woman's account had been so horrific that Hayes had initially hoped it was the product of a traumatized mind, but the medical examination had confirmed the worst of her claims. Sarah's body bore the scars of years of abuse, and her pregnancy, the result of rape by her own father, had ended in a miscarriage that nearly killed her. "Step away from the girl, Ashcroft," Hayes commanded, his deputies spreading out behind him to block the exits. The barn's layout worked against them. Too many shadows, too many places for the family members to hide or launch an attack. "Rebecca, you're safe now. Come with us." But Rebecca found herself frozen between two worlds, her mind reeling with confusion and terror. The only life she had ever known was being challenged by strangers who claimed to represent justice and salvation. Yet everything her father had taught her suggested that these men were agents of corruption, sent to destroy their sacred mission. "My daughter belongs to God and to this family," Josiah snarled, moving to stand protectively in front of Rebecca. "She will not be corrupted by your worldly poison. Thomas, take your bride to the altar. We will complete this ceremony despite these intruders." Thomas stepped forward, his hand reaching for Rebecca's arm, but she finally found the strength to move. She stumbled backward, away from both her brother and the sheriff, her mind struggling to process the conflicting emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what's right anymore. This is all I've ever known." Deputy Marcus Cole, the youngest of Hayes's men, felt his heart break at the sight of the girl's anguish. At 25, he had a sister Rebecca's age, and the thought of what this young woman had endured filled him with a rage that threatened to cloud his judgment. "Miss, you don't have to be afraid," he said gently, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're here to help you. No one will hurt you again." But Josiah's laughter cut through the deputy's words like a knife through flesh. "Help! You offer her damnation disguised as salvation. This child has been blessed by the Almighty, chosen to carry on the pure bloodline that will inherit the earth when the corruption of the outside world is finally cleansed away. The only corruption here is what you've done to these people," Hayes replied, his patience wearing thin as he took in the full scope of the horror before him. The barn itself told a story of depravity. The crude altar stained with what appeared to be dried blood, the twisted religious symbols carved into the walls, the hollow-eyed faces of family members who had been broken by years of abuse and indoctrination. Dr. Edmund Whitmore, who had accompanied the sheriff despite the obvious danger, stepped forward with his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. At 53, he had seen his share of human suffering, but nothing had prepared him for what Sarah Ashcroft had revealed during her examination. The girl's injuries had been so extensive, so clearly the result of systematic abuse, that he had been compelled to document every detail for the authorities. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Dr. Whitmore addressed Martha directly, his voice carrying the authority of his medical training. "I've examined your daughter, Sarah. The injuries she sustained, the evidence of repeated trauma. No loving God would demand such suffering from a child." Martha's face contorted with a mixture of pain and fanatic devotion. "Sarah was weak," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She allowed the devil to poison her mind against her family. Her flight from this sacred place proves her unworthiness to carry our bloodline forward." The doctor's face paled as he looked around the barn, taking in the full scope of the family's delusions. "Good God," he whispered, "what have you done here? These people, they're not just victims of abuse, they're victims of systematic brainwashing, of a religious mania that has consumed their ability to distinguish right from wrong. We have done the Lord's work," Thomas declared, his voice carrying the same fervent madness as his father's. "We have kept our blood pure, untainted by the corruption of outsiders. Our children may be few, but they are chosen by God Himself." Rebecca's mind flashed to memories she had tried desperately to suppress. Images of her younger siblings born with twisted spines and clouded eyes. The screams that echoed through the house during difficult births. The tiny graves that dotted the hillside behind their home. She thought of her cousin Mary, who had died in childbirth at 14, her body too small and damaged to safely deliver the child she carried. She remembered her brother James, whose mind had never developed beyond that of a child, despite his 20 years, and the countless other family members who bore the physical and mental scars of generations of inbreeding. "The children," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the tension that filled the barn. So many of them. They suffered so much. They were blessed, Josiah roared, his composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of the accusations being leveled against him. Every one of them was a gift from the Almighty, proof of our covenant with Him. Their struggles were tests of faith. Their deaths were calls to glory. You cannot understand because you have not received the divine revelations that guide our sacred mission. Sheriff Hayes had heard enough. The evidence was overwhelming. The physical condition of the family members, the obvious signs of abuse and neglect, the grotesque perversion of religious doctrine that had been used to justify unspeakable crimes. He signaled to his deputies, and they began to move forward with practiced caution. "Josiah Ashcroft," Hayes declared, his voice carrying the full authority of the law. "You're under arrest for crimes against nature, child abuse, incest, and murder. The rest of you will come with us for questioning and medical examination." But as the lawmen advanced, something extraordinary happened. The family members, who had shown confusion and fear moments before, began to rise from their seats with an eerie synchronization that sent chills down the spines of the deputies. Their faces, which had displayed doubt and uncertainty, now showed the same fanatic devotion as their patriarch. Years of indoctrination, of systematic brainwashing and isolation from the outside world had created a group of people who were more than willing to die for their beliefs. "You will not take us from our sacred home," Martha declared, producing a long carving knife from beneath her shawl. The blade gleamed in the candlelight, its edge honed to razor sharpness. "We would rather join our children in heaven than be dragged into your world of sin and corruption." Other family members began to reveal weapons that they had concealed beneath their clothing: kitchen knives, farming tools, even a rusty pistol that had belonged to Josiah's father. The barn, which had moments before been a place of twisted worship, now became a powder keg ready to explode into violence. Deputy Cole drew his weapon, his hands steady despite the bizarre nature of the confrontation. "Put down your weapons," he commanded. "Nobody has to get hurt here. We just want to help you." But help was the last thing the Ashcroft family wanted. To them, these lawmen represented everything they had been taught to fear and despise: the corruption of the outside world, the forces of evil that sought to destroy their sacred mission. They had been conditioned to view any challenge to their beliefs as a test of faith, and they were prepared to pass that test with their lives. Rebecca watched in horror as her family prepared to fight to the death rather than abandon the only way of life they had ever known. She realized that this confrontation would not end with arrests and trials. It would end in blood and death. And as she looked into the wild eyes of her father and brother, she understood that the true horror of the Ashcroft lineage was not just what they had done, but how completely they believed it was righteous. "Father, please," she tried one last time, her voice cutting through the tension like a prayer. "Look at what we've become. Look at the children who have died, the suffering we've caused. This can't be what God wants." Josiah's response was a roar of pure rage. "You dare question the divine revelations I have received? You, who were born from the sacred union of pure blood, would deny the very covenant that gave you life?" The standoff had reached its breaking point. In the flickering candlelight of the converted barn, two worlds were about to collide: the twisted reality of the Ashcroft family and the harsh justice of the outside world. Rebecca found herself caught in the middle, forced to choose between the only family she had ever known and the chance for a life free from the nightmare that had shaped her existence. The confrontation that would determine the fate of the Ashcroft lineage was about to explode into violence, and Rebecca sensed that before the night was over, the true cost of her family's sins would finally be revealed. The tension in the barn had reached a fever pitch, with both sides facing each other across the candlelit space like opposing armies preparing for battle. Sheriff Hayes could see the madness in the eyes of the Ashcroft family, a fanatical devotion that made them infinitely more dangerous than any common criminal he had ever faced. These people truly believed they were doing God's work, and that conviction made them capable of absolutely anything. "Nobody has to die here tonight," Hayes said, his voice steady despite the weapons now pointed in his direction. "Put down your weapons and come with us peacefully. We'll make sure you're treated fairly under the law." Josiah's response was a bark of bitter laughter that echoed off the barn walls like the cry of a wounded animal. "Fairly? You would drag us before judges who know nothing of divine law, who would condemn us for following the path that God himself has laid before us. There can be no fairness in a world that has turned its back on truth." Rebecca watched in growing horror as her uncle Ezra, a man who had always been gentle with her, now gripped a rusted scythe with white knuckles. Her Aunt Ruth, who had taught her to read from the family Bible, held a carving knife with the same devotion she had once shown for scripture. The transformation was complete. Her family had become something monstrous, willing to kill and die for their twisted beliefs. "Father," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the tension with desperate clarity, "please listen to me. I've seen what our ways have brought us. The children who died in agony, the suffering that marks every generation. This isn't what God wants. This can't be what he intended." Josiah's eyes blazed with fury as he turned on his daughter, his face contorting with rage and disappointment. "You dare question the divine revelations I have received? You, who were born from the sacred union of pure blood, would deny the very covenant that gave you life. I've seen the graves," Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to speak truths that had been suppressed for too long. "I've counted them, Father. 17 children dead before their 5th birthday. How can that be God's will? How can a loving deity demand such sacrifice from innocent babies, Doctor?" Whitmore stepped closer to Rebecca, his medical training compelling him to support her brave stand against the family's delusions. "Miss Ashcroft, you're speaking the truth. No loving deity would demand such sacrifice from innocent children. What I've seen here tonight, the physical evidence of genetic damage, the obvious signs of systematic abuse, this is the work of human madness, not divine will." Thomas raised his pistol, pointing it directly at the doctor with a steady hand that betrayed no doubt or hesitation. "Silence, outsider. You know nothing of our sacred mission. Those children were called home because they were too pure for this corrupted world. Their deaths were not tragedies, they were translations to glory. They died because of the sins of their parents," Rebecca shot back, her fear finally giving way to righteous anger. "Because brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters, created life that was never meant to be. I've seen the deformities, the suffering, the children who couldn't breathe properly because their bodies were twisted by our unholy unions." The words hung in the air like a physical blow, striking at the very foundation of the family's beliefs. Several family members shifted uncomfortably, doubt flickering in their eyes for the first time in years. But Josiah's voice rose above their uncertainty like a thunderclap, drowning out any possibility of rational thought. "Blasphemy!" he roared, his voice echoing off the barn walls with supernatural force. "You speak with the devil's tongue, child. Our bloodline is sacred, chosen by the Almighty to inherit the earth when the corruption of the outside world is finally cleansed away. Every child born to our family, whether they live or die, serves God's greater purpose." Martha stepped forward, her knife gleaming in the candlelight as she fixed her daughter with a gaze filled with fanatic devotion. "Rebecca, my daughter, you have been poisoned by these outsiders. Come back to us. Accept your place in God's plan. Take your brother's hand and fulfill your destiny." But Rebecca had seen too much, understood too much. The scales had fallen from her eyes, and she could no longer pretend that their way of life was anything but an abomination against nature and decency. "No, Mother. I won't be part of this anymore. I won't bring more suffering into the world. I won't watch more children die because of our sins. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, with both sides locked in a battle of wills that could only end in violence. But fate intervened in the form of young Timothy Ashcroft, Rebecca's 12-year-old cousin. The boy had been born with a clubfoot and a weak heart, products of the family's generations of inbreeding, and the excitement and tension of the confrontation proved too much for his fragile constitution. Timothy collapsed suddenly, his small body convulsing as he gasped for air. His lips turned blue, and his eyes rolled back in his head as his damaged heart struggled to pump blood through his malformed circulatory system. The sight of the child suffering cut through the tension in the barn like a knife, reminding everyone present of the true cost of the Ashcroft family's practices. "Timothy!" His mother, Rebecca's Aunt Sarah, cried out, dropping her weapon and rushing to her son's side. The maternal instinct that had been suppressed by years of religious indoctrination suddenly reasserted itself, and she knelt beside the boy, with tears streaming down her face. Dr. Whitmore moved instinctively toward the child, his medical training overriding the danger of the situation. "Let me help him. I'm a doctor. I can try to stabilize his condition." For a moment, the barn fell silent except for Timothy's labored breathing and his mother's quiet sobs. The family watched as the doctor knelt beside the boy, checking his pulse and listening to his chest with a stethoscope. The child's condition was clearly dire, another victim of the genetic damage caused by generations of incestuous breeding. "His heart is failing," Dr. Whitmore said quietly, his voice heavy with professional sorrow. "The muscle is malformed, probably from birth. This is what your pure bloodline has created. This boy is dying because of what you've done to your family." Josiah's face contorted with rage and denial, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. "You lie. Timothy is blessed by God, chosen for a higher purpose. His struggles are tests of faith, nothing more. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but as the boy's breathing grew more labored and his skin took on a grayish pallor, doubt began to creep into the faces of some family members. They had seen too many children suffer, too many die young, to completely ignore the doctor's words. The evidence was right there before them, a 12-year-old boy dying because his body had been damaged by the very practices they had been taught to revere. Rebecca knelt beside Timothy, taking his small hand in hers as tears streamed down her face. "It's going to be all right," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't true. She had watched too many of her relatives die young to believe otherwise. "I'm here with you." "Rebecca," Timothy gasped, his voice barely audible above his struggling breath. "I'm scared. Why does it hurt so much? Why can't I breathe?" "I know," she replied, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm scared too, but you're not alone. I'm here, and I won't leave you." As the boy's breathing became more shallow and irregular, Sheriff Hayes made his decision. The sight of the dying child had crystallized everything for him. This wasn't just about arresting criminals, it was about saving lives and preventing further suffering. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the emotional chaos. "This child needs immediate medical attention, and this family needs help. We're taking you all into custody, for your own good as much as for justice." But Josiah had reached the end of his rope. The challenge to his authority, the doubt in his family's eyes, and the undeniable evidence of their suffering had pushed him beyond the boundaries of reason. His carefully constructed delusion was collapsing, and rather than face the truth of what he had done, he chose to embrace the ultimate expression of his madness. "If we cannot live as God intended," he declared, raising his own weapon, a ceremonial dagger that had been used in countless rituals, "then we will die as martyrs to his cause. We will not be taken alive to face the judgment of a corrupted world." The patriarch's words were the spark that ignited the powder keg. The barn erupted into chaos as the Ashcroft family, driven by fanatical devotion and desperate fear, launched themselves at the lawman with weapons raised and murder in their hearts. The sound of gunfire echoed through the hills, mixing with screams of pain and rage as the confrontation exploded into deadly violence. In the midst of the chaos, Rebecca clutched Timothy's failing form and realized that the nightmare of the Ashcroft lineage was finally coming to its bloody end. But she also understood that the true horror was not just in what was happening now. It was in the knowledge that this violence could have been prevented if someone had acted sooner, if the outside world had not turned a blind eye to the suffering that had been hidden in these isolated hills for so many years. The gunfight in the barn lasted only 7 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to Rebecca as she shielded Timothy's weakening body from the chaos erupting around them. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood, creating an atmosphere that seemed to embody hell itself. Screams and curses filled the air as the Ashcroft family fought with the desperation of cornered animals, their fanatical devotion driving them to acts of suicidal violence. Sheriff Hayes had hoped to avoid bloodshed, but the family's resistance left him no choice. His deputies moved with practiced efficiency, trying to subdue rather than kill whenever possible. But the Ashcrofts fought as if their very souls depended on it. They showed no fear of death. Indeed, they seemed to welcome it as a form of martyrdom that would validate their twisted beliefs. Thomas fell first, his pistol smoking as Deputy Cole's bullet found its mark in the young man's chest. He collapsed beside the altar he had helped defile with years of unholy rituals, his blood mixing with the stains of previous ceremonies. As he lay dying, his lips moved in what appeared to be a prayer, though the words were lost in the chaos of battle. "Thomas!" Martha screamed, abandoning her attack on Dr. Whitmore to rush to her son's side. But her grief was short-lived. A stray bullet from her brother Ezra's ancient rifle caught her in the chest, and she crumpled to the barn floor beside her dying son. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed it. The family that had lived by violence and abuse was now dying by the same forces they had unleashed. Josiah fought like a man possessed, wielding his ceremonial dagger with surprising skill for his age. The blade had been used in countless rituals over the years, and it seemed to carry with it the accumulated evil of those ceremonies. He had managed to wound Deputy Harrison before Sheriff Hayes finally brought him down with a shot to the shoulder that spun him around and sent him crashing to the barn floor. The patriarch fell to his knees, his weapon clattering across the wooden planks, but his eyes still burned with unrepentant fury. Blood frothed at his lips as he struggled to speak, his voice carrying the same fanatic conviction that had driven him to commit unspeakable acts. "You have doomed yourselves," he gasped, his words barely audible above the dying echoes of gunfire. "God will not forgive this desecration of his chosen people. The pure bloodline will continue, and the earth will be cleansed of your corruption." As the gunfire died away, an eerie silence fell over the barn, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackling of overturned candles that threatened to set the building ablaze. Of the 23 Ashcroft family members who had gathered for the ceremony, 8 lay dead and 5 more were wounded. The survivors huddled together in the corners of the barn, their faces blank with shock and disbelief. The world they had known, the only world they had ever known, had been shattered in a matter of minutes. Rebecca looked down at Timothy, whose breathing had stopped during the chaos of the gunfight. The boy's face was peaceful now, free from the pain that had marked his short life. She closed his eyes gently, whispering a prayer for his soul, not to the twisted God her father had worshipped, but to the merciful deity she hoped might exist beyond the madness of her family's beliefs. "He's gone," she whispered to Dr. Whitmore, who had crawled over to check on the boy, despite the danger that still surrounded them. "He's finally free from the pain." The doctor nodded sadly, his professional demeanor cracking as he looked at the child's peaceful face. "He never had a chance," he said quietly. "None of these children ever had a chance. The genetic damage was too severe, the inbreeding too extensive. This boy's heart was malformed from birth. He was living on borrowed time. Dr. Whitmore moved among the wounded, doing what he could to save lives, regardless of what these people had done. His medical oath compelled him to treat even those who had tried to kill him moments before. As he worked, he documented the evidence of genetic damage that was visible in nearly every family member, the telltale signs of generations of inbreeding that had left its mark on their bodies and minds. "Sheriff," the doctor said quietly as he bandaged a young woman's arm, "you need to see this. The physical evidence of what they've done to themselves. It's worse than I imagined. Nearly every person here shows signs of genetic abnormalities. Cleft palates, extra digits, malformed limbs, developmental delays. This family has been systematically destroying itself for generations." Hayes nodded grimly, his face pale as he surveyed the carnage. He had seen violence before, had dealt with murderers and thieves and every manner of criminal, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Ashcroft family was both perpetrator and victim of their own twisted beliefs, and the children, especially those who had survived, bore the unmistakable marks of genetic disorders that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Josiah, despite his wound, continued to rant from his position on the floor. Blood loss had weakened him, but his fanatic conviction remained unshaken. "You think you have won," he wheezed, his voice barely above a whisper, "but you have only delayed the inevitable. The pure bloodline will continue. Others will take up our sacred mission. The world will be cleansed of its corruption, and the chosen will inherit the earth." "The only thing that will be cleansed is this place," Hayes replied, his voice heavy with disgust and exhaustion. "And the only inheritance your chosen will receive is a chance at a normal life away from your madness." As the survivors were led away in chains, Rebecca found herself walking beside Sheriff Hayes through the cool night air. The contrast between the suffocating atmosphere of the barn and the clean, crisp air outside was almost overwhelming. She breathed deeply for the first time in years, feeling as though she was emerging from a nightmare into something that might eventually resemble reality. "What will happen to us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question carried the weight of a lifetime of uncertainty. She had never known any world beyond the Ashcroft compound, and the prospect of life in the outside world terrified her almost as much as staying with her family had. Hayes looked at the young woman with compassion, recognizing the courage it had taken for her to stand up to her family's madness. "The adults will face trial for their crimes," he said gently. "But you and the other children, you'll have a chance to start over, to learn what normal life is like, to heal from what's been done to you." Rebecca nodded, though the prospect filled her with a mixture of hope and terror. Will they try to continue what my father started? Are there others who believe as he did?" Hayes's expression darkened at the question. It was something that had been troubling him as well, the possibility that the Ashcroft family's twisted beliefs might have spread beyond their isolated compound. "Not if I can help it," he replied firmly, "and not if you help us understand what really happened here. Your testimony could prevent others from falling into the same trap." As they walked away from the barn, Rebecca turned back for one last look at the place where she had spent so many nights in terror. The building stood silhouetted against the starry sky, its windows dark and empty. But even from a distance, she could swear she heard something, a faint sound that might have been wind through the broken boards, or might have been the echo of unholy hymns still lingering in the air. Dr. Whitmore joined them as they reached the sheriff's wagon, his medical bag heavy with the instruments he had used to treat the wounded. "I've done what I can for the survivors," he reported, his voice weary with the weight of what he had witnessed. "But Sheriff, we need to search the property thoroughly. If what Miss Sarah told us is true, there may be more evidence of their crimes hidden on the grounds." Hayes nodded, his mind already turning to the investigation that would follow. "We'll come back in the morning with more men and proper equipment. Tonight, we get these people to safety, and start the process of justice. As the wagon pulled away from the Ashcroft property, Rebecca watched the dark hills roll past and tried to imagine a future free from the nightmare of her past. But deep in her heart, she knew that the horror of the Ashcroft lineage would not end with arrests and trials. The damage had been done to the survivors, to the land itself, and to the very concepts of family and faith. The reckoning had begun, but Rebecca sensed that the true cost of her family's sins had yet to be fully revealed. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, she could feel the weight of generations of corruption pressing down like a physical presence, as if the evil that had consumed her family had taken on a life of its own. 6 months after the confrontation at the Ashcroft barn, Sheriff Hayes stood in the ruins of what had once been the family's main house, now nothing more than a blackened skeleton of charred timber and broken stone. The building had burned to the ground 3 weeks after the arrests, though no one could determine the cause of the fire. Some said it was lightning, others whispered about supernatural forces, but Hayes suspected it was the work of locals who wanted to erase any trace of the horrors that had taken place on the property. The November wind whistled through the skeletal remains of the structure, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something that made his skin crawl despite his years of experience with death and violence. Even in its destroyed state, the property seemed to emanate an aura of malevolence that affected everyone who set foot on it. The investigation had revealed horrors beyond even his worst expectations. Hidden beneath the house, they had discovered a network of tunnels and chambers where the family had conducted their most depraved rituals. The walls were covered with crude symbols carved into the stone, and the floors were stained with substances that Dr. Whitmore had confirmed were human blood and other bodily fluids. Most disturbing of all were the remains they had found, evidence of ritualistic murders that had been covered up for decades. 43 graves, Deputy Cole reported, his face pale as he emerged from the family cemetery behind the house. The young deputy had aged years in the months since the confrontation, haunted by nightmares of what he had witnessed. Most of them children, some as young as infants, and Sheriff. Some of the bodies show signs of ritual mutilation. Hayes closed his eyes, trying to block out the images that Cole's words conjured. The trial had been a sensation, drawing reporters and curiosity seekers from across the state and beyond. The surviving Ashcroft adults had been sentenced to death or life imprisonment, their crimes deemed too heinous for any lesser punishment. But the children, those who could be saved, had been placed in the care of distant relatives or charitable institutions, far from the tainted legacy of their birth. Rebecca had been the star witness, her testimony providing the detailed account that prosecutors needed to secure convictions. She had spoken with quiet dignity about the years of abuse, the forced marriages, the deaths of innocent children. Her courage had helped ensure that justice was served, but Hayes could see the toll it had taken on her. The young woman, who had once been trapped in a nightmare, now faced the equally daunting challenge of building a normal life from nothing. "How is she doing?" Hayes asked Dr. Whitmore, who had taken a personal interest in Rebecca's recovery and had been providing regular updates on her progress. "Better than I expected, considering what she's been through," the doctor replied, though his expression remained troubled. "She's living with a family in Cincinnati now, learning to read and write properly, trying to understand the world beyond these hills. But the damage runs deep, Sheriff. The psychological trauma, the years of indoctrination. It will take years for her to fully heal, if she ever does." Hayes nodded, understanding the weight of what Rebecca had endured. But his attention was drawn to a more immediate concern: the reports that had been filtering in from the surrounding area over the past several months. Strange sightings, unexplained sounds, and a growing sense of unease among the local population that seemed to center on the abandoned Ashcroft property. "Tell me about these incidents," he said to Cole, who had been investigating the reports with growing concern. The deputy consulted his notes, his expression troubled. It started about 2 months after the trial ended. Folks living near the old Ashcroft place began reporting strange sounds at night, chanting, screaming, things like that. Then there were the sightings. What kind of sightings? People claimed to see figures moving around the property after dark, always in groups, always wearing dark clothing. When we investigate, we never find anyone, but Cole hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to report. But what? But we find evidence that someone's been there, candles burned down to stubs, fresh symbols carved into trees, and sometimes we find blood. Animal blood, we think, but we can't be sure. Dr. Whitmore frowned, his scientific mind struggling to process the implications of the reports. Could it be surviving family members? Perhaps some escaped our initial roundup, or distant relatives who weren't present during the confrontation. Hayes shook his head firmly. We accounted for everyone. The few who survived the gunfight are all in custody or dead. This is something else entirely. As if summoned by their conversation, a local farmer named Jacob Miller approached the group, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. Miller was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or superstitious beliefs, which made his report all the more disturbing. "Sheriff Hayes," Miller said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to report something. Last night I saw them again." "Saw who, Jacob?" "The ones who come to the old place. But this time I got close enough to see their faces." Miller's voice broke, and his hands shook as he removed his hat. "Sheriff, they looked just like the Ashcrofts. Same features, same eyes, same wrongness about them. But that's impossible, ain't it? They're all dead or locked up." Hayes felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the November wind. "Describe exactly what you saw, Jacob. Every detail." "There were maybe 15 of them gathered around that old barn. They were singing, if you can call it that. Sounded more like animals howling than any human music. And they had someone with them, someone tied up and struggling." Miller's face went white as he recalled the scene. "Sheriff, I think they were about to sacrifice that person, just like the old stories say the Ashcrofts used to do." "Doctor." Whitmore stepped forward, his scientific training compelling him to seek rational explanations. "Mr. Miller, are you certain of what you saw? The mind can play tricks, especially when dealing with traumatic events. Could it have been shadows, or perhaps local troublemakers trying to capitalize on the notoriety of the place?" "I know what I saw, Doc," Miller replied firmly, "and I know what I heard. They were calling on their God, asking for his blessing on their sacred work, and said they were going to continue the bloodline, no matter what the law did to stop them." Hayes exchanged glances with his deputy, both men understanding the terrifying implications of Miller's report. If there were other Ashcroft family members, distant relatives perhaps, or followers who had adopted their beliefs, then the nightmare was far from over. "We need to organize a search party," Hayes decided. "Tonight. If there are people out there continuing the Ashcrofts' work, we need to stop them before they can do any more harm." But even as he spoke, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they were fighting something larger and more insidious than a single family's madness. The Ashcroft lineage had been built on corruption and sustained by fanatical belief, and such things had a way of spreading like a disease, infecting new minds and creating new horrors. As the sun set over the Ohio hills, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Hayes prepared for what he feared would be another confrontation with the forces of evil that seemed to have taken root in this cursed land. Rebecca, safe in her new home in Cincinnati, would sometimes wake in the night with the sound of unholy hymns echoing in her ears. She would tell herself it was just a nightmare, a remnant of her traumatic past, but deep in her heart she knew the truth. The evil that had consumed her family was still out there, still growing, still seeking new flesh to corrupt and new souls to damn. The Ashcroft lineage had been broken, but its legacy lived on in the shadows of the Ohio hills, waiting for the right moment to emerge once again and continue its grim work. That night, As Hayes and his men approached the abandoned property, they could see the flickering light of candles in the ruins of the old barn. The sound of chanting drifted across the hills, carrying with it the same unholy fervor that had driven the original Ashcroft family to commit their unspeakable crimes. "Dear God," Deputy Cole whispered as they crept closer to the building. "It's true. They're really here." Through the broken walls of the barn, they could see figures moving in the candlelight, men and women whose faces bore the unmistakable features of the Ashcroft bloodline. But these were not the family members they had arrested months before. These were new converts to the twisted faith, people who had been drawn to the property by the dark legacy of its former inhabitants. In the center of the group, bound and gagged, was a young woman whose terrified eyes reflected the candlelight. She was to be their sacrifice, their offering to the dark god that the Ashcrofts had worshipped for generations. "We end this tonight," Hayes declared, his voice grim with determination. "Whatever it takes, we end this curse once and for all." But as they prepared to move in, the chanting suddenly stopped. The figures in the barn turned toward the approaching lawman with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness, and Hayes realized that the true horror of the Ashcroft lineage was not just what they had done, it was what they had awakened and what they had left behind to continue their work. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Hayes could only pray that this time they would be able to destroy the evil completely before it could spread any further into the world.